The dog didn't move at first, just sat there, square and silent on the porch of the mess hall. Dust swirled around his wiry paws. His muzzle was gray, his eyes tired, and his presence massive. A young Japanese nurse froze mid-step, her tray trembling. Behind her, the other women stilled too. The guards had warned them, "Don't touch the dog." The old hound didn't take kindly to strangers, and yet, on this strange morning, the mutt raised his head, growled low, and then wandered forward, not with teeth, but with a slow tail wag and a heavy sigh, collapsing beside her feet. She stared down, stunned, as the dog nudged her boot, then placed his head on her ankle like it was a pillow. Laughter from the guards, muffled gasps from the prisoners. No one could believe it. In a war that had dehumanized them all, the first sign of trust didn't come from a man, but a dog too tired to hate. The trucks rumbled through the desert like metal ghosts, their wheels grinding dust into the earth as the vast American Southwest unfolded in every direction. There was no welcome here, only a land so wide and so quiet it felt like it belonged to no one. The sky was an endless stretch of heat-blurred blue, the ground a tapestry of baked clay and brittle grass. Inside the trucks, the women clung to silence as tightly as they clutched their uniforms, their knees pressed together, their eyes trained on nothing. Some had spent weeks surviving jungle rot, enemy fire, and starvation. Now they were here, in the unknown, surrounded by a silence too loud to trust. They had been told to expect brutality. Some had imagined cages, others imagined jeers or worse. Every woman on that truck carried the weight of 100 warnings, issued by instructors, officers, even family. Surrender meant shame. Capture was worse than death. One woman had whispered it the night before, "They will not feed us. They will not speak to us. They will strip us of our names." It was not paranoia. It was doctrine. As the trucks creaked to a stop before a modest compound framed by wire and dust, the tension inside the women's chests grew sharp and unbearable. But instead of snarling guards and barking orders, there was a strange and jarring stillness. No shouting, no chaos. The air smelled not of sweat and rot, but of sun-warmed wood and something faintly like bread. Guard towers stood like silent sentinels in the distance. The gate creaked open with a sound more tired than menacing. The guards who waited wore pressed uniforms, their faces drawn with sunburn and tedium, not malice. One flipped through a clipboard. Another scratched his jaw. Their postures spoke of routine, not rage. It was this absence of hostility that confused the women most. This sterile, procedural rhythm that seemed to suggest they were just another shipment. Not enemies, not animals, just bodies, names to be processed. That's when the women saw him, the man leaning against the side of a wooden shack, half in shadow. His broad-brimmed hat was tilted back, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, his face weathered not by war, but by sun and age. He did not wear a soldier's badge. His belt held no sidearm. He looked like something out of a legend or a foreign postcard, American myth made real. A cowboy. And sitting beside him, unmoving, was the dog. The hound was large, bony, with stiff joints and a faded coat the color of old rope. His ears twitched lazily, his tail still. His muzzle, touched with white, rested on folded paws. He did not bark, he did not growl, but his gaze was sharp, following the women like a slow-moving current of thought. The guards made no mention of him, but one nodded toward the dog and said something low to a colleague. The other just replied, "Yeah, don't go near him." The prisoners were herded off the truck with curt hand gestures, no shouting, no physical force. They moved like shadows, uncertain whether to obey or resist. Each footfall stirred dust. Each step felt like walking into a lie. This was not what they'd been promised. This place, with its organized rows of barracks and the smell of cornbread wafting from the mess hall, didn't match the images burned into their minds. The women lined up beneath the sun, heat baking their shoulders through thin uniforms. Their eyes darted. No one dared to look too long at the guards. No one dared to speak, but many glanced toward the dog. And he just sat there, watching. In a world they did not understand, where cruelty had been expected and kindness was terrifying, it was not the men with rifles who held their attention. It was the hound on the porch, whose silence felt heavier than any weapon, and somehow more honest. The women learned his presence was not accidental but permanent, stitched into the fabric of the camp like the barbed wire and the dust. By the time the first full day had passed, they realized the hound was always there. Morning, he lay by the steps of the mess hall, chin resting on his paws as the cooks clanged tins behind him. Midday, he shifted to a patch of shade near the supply shed, his ribs rising and falling in slow, patient breaths. Evening, he returned to the porch as if it were his post, not assigned, not negotiated, simply chosen. He watched the prisoners with the same heavy-lidded gaze he gave the guards. He was not a pet. He was not a mascot. He was a participant, though no one knew in what. Whispers began to move through the barracks faster than the desert wind. "The dog has bitten guards," one woman muttered as she folded her blanket again and again, for no reason other than to calm her shaking hands. "3 of them," another replied, her voice barely air. The number hung between them like a warning charm, passed from mouth to mouth, growing sharper with each retelling. They said he had once taken a sergeant's hand when the man tried to shove him off the porch. They said he snapped at a cook for stepping too close while he slept. These stories grew in the dark like vines, fed by fear and the need for explanation. This was a safer myth than kindness. An unfriendly dog made more sense than a peaceful camp. For many of the women, the unease went deeper than rumor. In their villages, dogs had not been companions curled by hearths or walked for pleasure. They had been guards, strays, scavengers, sometimes half-wild creatures with ribs like spider webs and eyes full of hunger. Children were warned to stay away. A dog's teeth were not symbols of loyalty, but of danger, infection, survival. To see this animal, heavy and silent, stationed so close to the place where they ate, felt like another test, another American cruelty dressed as normalcy, a reminder, perhaps, that they were still watched, still at risk, even if no one raised a hand. But the most unsettling thing was not his growl, it was his quiet. He did growl, yes, low, vibrating sounds that rolled from his chest when guards approached too quickly, or when someone tried to shoo him away with a boot. His lips would curl slightly, revealing teeth worn but still sharp, and men twice his size would step back without protest. And yet he never barked. Not once. Not when trucks arrived. Not when whistles shrilled. Not when planes passed overhead in distant lines. His silence was like a law he had written for himself, a decision. It made his presence feel deliberate, as though he were withholding something rather than lacking it. The women noticed this more than the men did. They watched how he observed everything, how his eyes tracked movement without urgency, how his ears flicked at every unfamiliar sound, but his body remained still. One woman, who had once been a schoolteacher before the war emptied her town of children and chalkboards, said he looked like a soldier who had seen too much to waste energy on noise. No one laughed. Days passed, and the dog's name crept into the air like dust settling on shelves. Hank the guards sometimes called him, as if it were only another tool on the inventory list. Hank. Short, plain, American. The name itself felt foreign on the women's tongues, like a word that did not belong to the mouth. A young nurse from Hiroshima, her sleeves rolled loosely around thin wrists, stepped slightly out of line as she passed. Too close, some whispered later. Close enough to tempt him. Her shoulders were stiff, like a soldier bracing for inspection. She did not look at him. She looked beyond him, as though ignoring him would make him vanish. But the dog lifted his head. He watched her, eyes following the tremble in her hands as she adjusted her tray. For a moment, no one moved. Not the guards, not the women. Even the air seemed to pause. Then, slowly, without sound, without a growl, he shifted his weight. His front paws stretched forward. His body rose with the reluctance of age, and he stepped off the wooden porch. Dust stirred beneath his pads as he walked toward her. Every woman froze. He stopped inches from her boot, sniffed once, then lowered his head again. Not in submission, not in threat, just lowered it as if he had chosen a place in the world and decided that this was it. He did not demand, he did not retreat, he only stood there. And she, unsure if she should breathe or break, stared down at him in silence, her eyes wide with something she did not yet have a name for. The moment passed, but it never truly ended. From that day forward, the Hound no longer belonged solely to the porch or the shadows. He began to move among them. Not often, not urgently, but enough. Enough to leave a trace. Enough to make them second-guess the borders they had drawn in their minds. The same nurse who had stood frozen with a tray in her hands now found herself watching for him in the morning, her eyes trailing past the mess line, wondering if he would come again. The next week, something else shifted. The scent arrived before the bell, thick and warm and unbelievable. It curled through the windows of the barracks and settled over the dirt yard like a memory from someone else's life. It was sweet, not cloying, but rich in a way that reminded some of the women of New Year's mochi, others of a distant childhood kitchen they'd forgotten existed. Cornbread. They didn't know the name yet, but the smell worked its way into their bones. Lining up for breakfast had become a routine, but today there was tension different from fear. They whispered about the dog again. He was already there, stretched across the porch of the mess hall like he'd been carved from the desert itself. A few women hesitated, remembering the rumors. One guard passed by and muttered dryly to his companion, "Old Hank's got a nose for anything fried." The women didn't understand the words, but they understood the tone, the familiarity. It made them uneasy, not because it was cruel, but because it wasn't. Inside, steam clouded the air. Trays slid across counters. Hands, both American and Japanese, touched metal and bread and coffee without confrontation. When the nurse received her portion, she stared at the small golden square beside her eggs, its edges crisp, its center impossibly soft. She turned to leave, then caught herself. The Hound had moved. He was standing again, slow, deliberate, and this time he was walking directly toward her. She froze. The chatter behind her dimmed. He stopped only a foot away. No growl, no tail wag, just a presence. Then, with the patience of a grandfather and the gravity of a god, he sat. Dust kicked up around his haunches. His eyes met hers, calm and full of something she could not place. Then he blinked. Slowly, like a sigh. The nurse dropped her gaze and, without knowing why, broke off a small corner of the cornbread and laid it gently in the dirt between them. The dog did not lunge for it. He simply waited. Waited until she had stepped past, then leaned forward, sniffed, and took the piece gently between his teeth. It was not an act of begging, it was something closer to communion. Word spread, not in gossip, but in awe. Hank had taken food from a prisoner, not from a guard, not from the cowboy who poured grain in his bowl, but from a woman who had arrived expecting fists and found herself handing over bread like an offering. The cornbread became more than food. It became a moment, a crack in the wall. The start of something no one had prepared for, and the scent lingered long after the meal had ended, on fingers, on breath, in memory. A scent not of survival, but of softness, of a life that was not supposed to be possible behind barbed wire. That night, the stars hung low and sharp above the barracks, as if the sky itself was leaning down to listen. There was no wind, only the rhythmic creak of wood cooling in the desert air and the faint rustle of straw mattresses as the women shifted in their sleep, or tried to. For many, sleep did not come, not easily. The silence was not the absence of noise, but the presence of something unspoken, something unsettled. The nurse lay with her blanket pulled tight around her shoulders, eyes fixed on the dark shape of the ceiling. Her body was still, but her mind wandered like a ghost. Again and again it returned to the image, the old hound resting his head on her foot, the warmth of him, the simple weight of trust. She had spent years believing that dignity was a currency only traded within her own people, that the enemy offered only cruelty, and to accept kindness from them was to become something less than Japanese. That belief had been part of her armor. And now, a dog, an old growling thing that was supposed to hate her, had shattered it without warning, without force, just by choosing to rest. The others had seen it, too. After the mess hall incident, the story spread not with excitement but with unease. A few women whispered about omens. Others dismissed it, saying it was a fluke, the dog must have been ill. But there was no denying the shift. The nurse had felt it in the way the guards looked at her later. Curious, almost soft. She felt it in the glances from the other prisoners. Not admiration, not judgment. Something closer to confusion. If the dog could accept her presence, even for a moment, what else might they have misunderstood? Her thoughts drifted back to her training. The long concrete hallways of the facility, the sharp slap of shoes during drills, the echo of shouted mantras. Death before disgrace. Better to vanish than be captured. They had repeated these words like prayers. Their instructors had not spoken of comfort. Comfort was betrayal. Survival was conditional, honorable only if it came through victory. Anything else, surrender, imprisonment, softness, was shame. She had believed it completely. Until now. Now she remembered how the instructors warned them. If the Americans feed you, it is a trap. If they clothe you, it is humiliation. If they are kind, they are mocking you. But there had been no mockery in the dog's gesture, no trap in the way he lowered his body beside her, only a wordless, deliberate closeness. She turned on her side, the straw beneath her crunching softly. She could still feel the heat of his breath through the worn leather of her shoe. She had not spoken during dinner, not even to the woman beside her, but her silence had not been out of fear. It was something else, an unraveling, a peeling back of belief. And she wasn't alone. Across the room, others lay awake too. She could hear the soft intake of breath, the occasional sigh. The quiet was thick with thought. No one dared say it yet, but the idea had begun to take root. If an American dog could offer rest instead of teeth, then what else might be possible? What other truths had been buried beneath the noise of war and pride and loyalty? She closed her eyes and let the stars press down through the slats of the window. The ceiling looked the same, but something inside her had shifted. The silence beneath the stars was no longer empty. It was full of questions, and those, more than rifles or fences, were what kept her awake. The questions didn't disappear with the sun. If anything, they multiplied in daylight, bouncing from bunk to bunk, carried in glances and half-sentences, too fragile to name out loud. By the third morning after the dog's quiet gesture, the women noticed he was appearing more often, not just on the porch of the mess hall, but along the gravel paths near the garden plots, beside the laundry line where soap-slicked water spilled into the dirt. He came not like a shadow, not like a sentinel. He came like someone checking in on his land. They didn't call to him. That would have felt wrong. And he never asked to be called. But more of them started watching him as they passed, eyes lingering longer than before. Some slowed their pace. Some pretended to drop crumbs from their bread. Others simply looked, not with fear now, but with a kind of hesitant curiosity, as if hoping he might explain something the guards never would. The dog did not change his behavior dramatically. He still growled if someone startled him, still ignored the guards with equal disinterest, but he no longer avoided the prisoners. That alone was enough to unsettle every assumption they'd brought to this place. It was during the midday meal, under the shade of the outdoor awning, that the most surprising thing happened. The women had lined up as usual, trays in hand, sweat collecting beneath their collars. The air buzzed with flies and the scent of fried onions. The dog had stationed himself at the edge of the building, head resting on his paws, his eyes slits against the sun. A woman near the back of the line, a tall, sunburnt former typist from Nagoya, stepped out of formation without thinking. Maybe it was the heat, or the hunger, or the exhaustion of pretending not to feel anything for so many days. Whatever it was, she took 2 slow steps forward and reached out, hesitantly, to touch the dog's back. The other women froze. So did the nearest guards. A few looked toward the cowboy leaning against the mess hall doorway, hat tipped forward to shade his eyes. He didn't move, didn't react. He just watched. The dog raised his head, looked at the hand, then let it rest. The woman didn't stroke him like a pet. She placed her palm flat between his shoulders just once, then pulled back. The dog exhaled, low and long, and lowered his head again, as if to say, "Fine." That was all. But it wasn't small. The whisper of it reached every corner of the camp before nightfall. The dog had allowed a prisoner to touch him, not a guard, not the cook, one of them. And he had not growled. The cowboy, when asked later by one of the Americans what he made of it, only shrugged. "He's old, picks who he picks." But the women understood there was something more in that indifference, a permission, or maybe not permission, just absence of objection, and that too was radical. It had never occurred to them that neutrality could be more subversive than kindness. The dog wasn't giving them affection. He was allowing them to exist near him without fear. And if he could do that, what else had they misunderstood? What other parts of this place, this enemy, this war, might not be what they had been told? The notice was posted just after breakfast, typed in 2 languages and nailed to the barrack door. Prisoners may write 1 letter home per month. Most of the women stared at it as if it were a trick. A few laughed, dry, bitter sounds with no real humor. Write? To whom? For what purpose? Some had families who likely thought they were dead. Others had families who wished they were dead, for the shame they carried. And even if the letters were written, who could believe they would be sent? This, surely, was another form of interrogation, a soft one, a test, a trap. And yet, they wrote. Not all, but enough. That evening, as the guards handed out lined sheets of government-issued paper, the room shifted, the chatter dulled, pens were uncapped, backs curled over knees, and across the room, silence bloomed. Not the silence of suspicion, but of effort, of reaching across oceans and grief to find the right words for people who may no longer exist. One woman began her letter with a description of the camp's food. Another wrote about the desert heat, how it made her bones feel like paper. A few described the barracks, wooden, dry, cleaner than expected. But it wasn't until one of the younger women, a girl who had barely finished school before being conscripted, wrote a single strange line at the bottom of her page that something shifted again. "There is a dog here. He does not hate us." That sentence passed through the camp faster than any official order. It was not read aloud, but repeated in whispers. "He does not hate us." It felt like blasphemy, like revelation. The dog, Hank, had become more than just a curiosity. He was now a symbol of unpredictability, of contradiction, of humanity where none had been expected. The letters became more honest after that. Still careful, still composed, but cracks began to show through the formal phrasing. "We are not treated cruelly. We have blankets. There is music sometimes over a radio. We can grow vegetables." Words like cornbread and apples appeared, foreign on the page, but impossible to leave out. One woman tried to describe a moment where a guard had handed her a new pair of socks. She wrote it and rewrote it 3 times, worried it might sound too grateful. But always, somewhere between the rations and the quiet, the dog would appear. The dog sleeps near the steps. He growls at everyone except us. He does not wag his tail, but he stays. It became a kind of emotional shorthand, mentioning the dog without explaining why. Because they couldn't explain it. Not fully. But they all understood what it meant. If even a creature raised in this strange foreign land could choose not to hate them, then perhaps the world was wider than they had believed. Some of the guards noticed the change. One asked a translator what the women were writing. The translator shrugged. "Home things," he said, which wasn't exactly a lie. But it wasn't the whole truth either, because what they were really writing was something else entirely, a record of small mercies, a proof of contradictions, a quiet declaration that the enemy was no longer entirely monstrous, and that they, perhaps, were no longer entirely broken. In the weeks that followed, the dog stopped being a mystery and became something more permanent, an unspoken part of their lives, like the sun or the fences. He no longer lingered only near the mess hall or the cowboy's shack. Instead, he began appearing during the midday rest periods, when the women were allowed to sit in the thin shade of the barrack walls, their bodies limp with heat and silence. There, amid the dust and exhaustion, he would settle, not in front of them, not behind them, but among them, not choosing favorites, not demanding attention, just there. His presence was not grand. He did not lick hands or roll for bellies. He did not beg. But the comfort was in his simplicity. He would curl beside one woman's feet, lean against another's calf, or simply lay a few feet away, his chest rising and falling in time with the hum of cicadas. And the women who had once flinched at his gaze now found themselves drawing strength from that closeness. They didn't speak about it much. They didn't need to. The silence they shared with him was not the silence of fear anymore. It was the silence of belonging. Food became a kind of language. After meals, a few women began slipping scraps into the folds of their skirts, bits of biscuit, slivers of apple, a corner of cornbread wrapped in cloth. They didn't feed him like a pet. They offered the food the way one might offer incense, a quiet, reverent gesture. He never took the food right away. Sometimes he sniffed it and walked on. Sometimes he accepted it so slowly it felt like a ritual. When he did, the woman would say nothing, just nod to herself, barely visible. It was a kind of conversation that required no words. The guards noticed, of course, but their reactions were strange, not angry, not mocking. If anything, they were curious. Some of the younger ones even smiled when they saw the dog sleeping near the women, as if the sight reminded them of home. One of the older guards, a thick-necked man with a permanent scowl, muttered once, "That mutt's gone soft." But there was no malice in it, only resignation. The war, it seemed, was softening in the smallest of places. It was the cowboy who explained it best, though he never used many words. One afternoon a corporal asked him, half joking, why the dog preferred the prisoners now. The cowboy barely looked up from his tool bench, just said, "He knows who's scared and who ain't." That answer lingered, because it didn't sound like the dog was choosing sides. It sounded like he was choosing truth. And in a place where uniforms determined everything, status, danger, humanity, Hank the dog had become the one living thing who didn't care about cloth or rank. He responded only to fear. And lately, the prisoners were no longer afraid. At least, not in the same way. The change wasn't just in the women, it was in the air between them and the guards. Orders were still given, rules still applied, but the tone had shifted. Instructions came with less bark, with more patience. The guards began using names instead of numbers. One offered a piece of gum, another a photo of his child. These were not friendships, but they were recognitions, a small bridge not built by diplomacy or strategy, but perhaps by proximity to a dog who asked for nothing but honesty. And that was the strangest part of all. It wasn't the dog's warmth that had altered the space between prisoner and captor. It was his refusal to pretend. He didn't wag, he didn't smile. He simply existed in a way that allowed everyone to lay down their armor, if only for a moment. And once they did, it became harder to pick it back up. In the barracks at night, some women began to share small stories again. Before the war, before the uniforms, a child's laugh, a mother's soup, a river they used to swim in. Stories that had once felt like betrayals of discipline now felt like threads stitching something back together. And in the still heat of the afternoon, the Hound would find his place in the shade, lay his head down, and close his eyes. Not because he had made peace, but because he had offered it. Without saying a word, it started as a rumor, quiet, almost laughable, that prisoners were being allowed to send small items back to Japan. A letter, a toothbrush, a bar of American soap. Some women dismissed it as another misunderstanding, another trick of translation or protocol. But then the guards confirmed it. A few women, chosen by unknown criteria, were handed small packages wrapped in brown paper and told they could include something to go home. Most chose the obvious: words, folded letters that bore the weight of everything they couldn't say. But one woman, quiet, older, her hair already streaked with white, chose something different. She had been watching the dog for weeks, not with fascination, but with the steady attention of someone who had once raised animals of her own. She never fed him, never reached out, but every afternoon, when the sun had burned off its anger and begun to mellow, she sat near him and wrote. Sometimes he slept close to her feet. Once he lay beside her, their backs nearly touching, both facing west. A corporal had snapped the photo as part of a routine inspection. It was meant to show camp morale, compliance, perhaps something useful for a report. But when he showed it to the cowboy later, the man only glanced at it and said, "Damn fool, looks like they've been through the same war." The woman asked for the photo. No one objected. Maybe they thought it wouldn't matter. She included it in her package home, tucked behind the letter, sealed between layers of soft, government-issued tissue. The photo showed her cross-legged in the dirt, pencil in hand, eyes half-focused. Behind her, the Hound lay sprawled like a second shadow, his body relaxed, his ears alert, as if guarding something invisible. Weeks later, in a cluttered office in Tokyo, a military censor opened the envelope. The man was middle-aged, tired, his hands stained with ink. He read the letter quickly, then unfolded the photograph and stared. He didn't understand what he was seeing. There was no violence in the image, no defiance, but it disturbed him more than propaganda ever had. A prisoner of war was supposed to be thin, broken, pleading. Here, instead, was a woman who looked, if not happy, then profoundly unafraid, and beside her, an American dog resting without chains. He turned the photo over, expecting some annotation. There was none, just a date. The power of that image was its stillness. It didn't argue, it didn't accuse, but it defied everything the censors had taught themselves to believe, that Americans were cruel, that capture was dishonor, that survival in enemy hands was a kind of death. And yet here was proof of something else: dignity in captivity, even tenderness. Soap could be dismissed as bribery, blankets as trickery. But the dog couldn't be explained away. He wasn't trained, he wasn't symbolic. He simply existed and chose where to rest. That made him dangerous. The photo was never delivered. No one said why. It disappeared into a drawer, or maybe a fire, but it lived on in memory. The woman never received word. She never expected to. What mattered to her wasn't the outcome. It was the act, the risk of sending truth into silence. And in that truth was the quiet revolution of the entire camp, that the enemy could be cruel and kind, that survival could include small human mercies, and that sometimes the most powerful rebellion came in the form of a shared silence between a prisoner with a pencil and a hound with no allegiance. If you've enjoyed this story so far, give the video a like and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. It was the quiet that came first, not a silence like the ones before, thick with fear or calculation, but a deeper stillness, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Rumors had been circling for days, whispers of ceasefires, of cities in ruins, of Hirohito's voice on the radio. The war, it was said, was ending, or had already ended. No one knew for sure, because the truth moved slower than fear, and hope even slower still. But something had shifted. The guards walked differently. The officers no longer barked orders, and the prisoners, they waited. And then, one night, the dog didn't come. It was a small absence at first, easy to dismiss. He had missed meals before, wandered off for hours. But when breakfast passed without the dull thud of his paws on the porch, and lunch without his shadow lingering near the garden fence, unease began to bloom. By dinner, the silence was unbearable. One of the women finally asked the cowboy as he handed out trays. He didn't look up, just muttered, "He's old, needs rest." But they all knew something had changed, and that knowledge hurt more than anyone expected. These were women who had been trained not to feel, who had marched under flags that demanded obedience over emotion, who had been told again and again that survival in captivity was shame. But they had survived, and now, without ceremony, they found themselves mourning a dog they once feared. A dog who had never licked their hands, who had never begged for affection, who had never barked or whined or wagged. A dog who had simply chosen, for reasons of his own, to sit beside them in the heat. And that had been enough. What they missed was not his protection, or even his presence, but what his presence had made possible, the quiet, wordless recognition of their humanity. They had come to count on that, had shaped their days around his stillness. Now, in his absence, something inside them sagged. One woman, a former teacher, sat on her cot that night and traced the seam of the blanket she'd received 2 months earlier. It was soft, thick, too warm for desert heat. She had almost sent it home. Instead, she kept it. She didn't know why, but tonight she folded it across her lap like a memory. She remembered how the dog had once rested his chin on that very blanket, just for a moment, long enough to leave a faint patch of dust in the shape of his breath. What did you do, she wondered, with kindness you hadn't asked for? What did you do with mercy that came too late? Because that was the cruelty of it. The war was ending, but not in triumph, not in resolution. It was ending in quiet contradictions, soap and dogs and blankets and letters that might never reach their destinations. It was ending in the way peace often did, too late for the dead, too complicated for the living. They had been told their captors would humiliate them, that the Americans were beasts, and some had been cruel, but others had not. And the dog, he had been the strangest of all. He hadn't demanded their loyalty or surrendered his own. He had merely chosen to be present again and again until his absence taught them more than his growl ever had. Some wept, quietly, in their beds, not for home or for lost battles, but for a creature who had offered no explanations and who now was simply gone. There were still rations to eat and guards to obey and rumors to endure, but something had ended that day, not just a war, but the space that fear had once occupied, and in its place a grief more intimate than rage, the grief of realizing you had been seen, even when you thought you were invisible, by a dog, and that was enough. The gates opened without ceremony, just the long groan of metal dragged back on dry hinges, and a silence that rang louder than any command. There was no music, no officials, no speeches, just the desert sun rising higher and the dust curling around boots that had stood still too long. The women waited, some clutching small cloth bundles, others with arms stiff at their sides. Each carried the weight of something unnameable. Shame, maybe, or memory. All they knew was that today they would leave the camp. No one cheered, no one smiled. Freedom, it turned out, was not a moment of joy, but one of disorientation, like waking from a fevered dream and not knowing what day it was, or who you'd become in the meantime. Beyond the gates stood a row of buses, too bright in the sun, their engines humming with indifferent purpose. Guards called names, lines were formed. Women walked toward a future they had not been allowed to imagine. Behind them, the camp stretched still and sparse, a place that had held them but not broken them. And on the front porch of the mess hall, as immovable as ever, sat the Hound. He lay in the shade, chin resting between crossed paws, eyes half-closed, tracking their movements without comment or emotion. The cowboy stood beside him, arms crossed, hat low. There was no change in his posture, no parting words. He had never spoken more than necessary, and today was no exception. Still, something in the set of his jaw betrayed what they all felt. This parting was not simple. It wasn't clean. Some stories don't end, they just pause, folded into the quiet. As each woman passed through the gate, they turned, not all, but enough, to look back. Not at the barracks or the guards, not at the wires that had once meant containment, but at the porch, at him, the dog, the one who had never wagged his tail, never barked, never asked for affection, the one who had, through stillness alone, given them the unthinkable, the feeling of being seen not as prisoners or enemies, but as people. Some lowered their heads in thanks, some blinked away tears, one or two mouthed words they couldn't say aloud, but the dog did not stir. He had never followed them before, and he would not follow them now. That was never his role. His presence had always been conditional, not a gift, but a quiet offering. Temporary, unexplained. One woman, the nurse who had first felt him settle at her feet all those months ago, stopped at the threshold. She looked back for a long moment, the line behind her shifting with impatience. And then, as if moved by something older than war or pride or even language, she bowed. Not deeply, not like to an officer, just enough. Enough for meaning to pass between them. A nod to the living symbol of everything this camp had become. Painful, strange, confusing, but never entirely cruel. The dog didn't blink, didn't nod, didn't lift his head, but she knew he saw. She boarded the bus, and the doors closed behind her with a hiss, like exhaled breath. As the engine groaned into motion and the wheels bit into the desert, the camp began to fade into distance. The fences blurred, the towers vanished, and on the porch, still as stone, the Hound watched them go. Years later, the women would speak little of the camp. Some would marry, others would never speak of the war again. But in quiet moments, folding laundry or watching a child sleep, they would think of a dog who once lay beside them in the dust and made them feel, for a moment, not defeated, but whole. If this story moved you, please like the video and leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from. It helps us tell more forgotten stories like this.